then we move over to Matthew 2, and we get the only account of the Magi. And here we start at the beginning of the chapter, and it says, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." So the wise men, another name for that is Magi, like magician. It's the same idea. We think of that word a little bit differently today, but in those days, those were people that were the wise men. They knew things. They worked with the stars and astronomy, just like Abraham did down in Egypt with Pharaoh in his court. They helped prophesy, right? Remember in Egypt, when Moses and Aaron are there in front of Pharaoh, they have magicians or magi. They're wise men within a king's court, typically. Daniel in Babylon is a wise man. And oftentimes it's something that would be very similar to what we would think of as a prophet. And again, a lot of what they talked about, it's not astrology, so to speak, but they determined timing and different things from the movement of the stars. And this was important in life back then, because when you would know when to plant your seed, you would know when harvest would be. The calendar was life or death for civilization back then. And it was a very priestly thing as well. When are the feasts supposed to be? Do we do this once a week, once a month with certain sacrifices? The calendar was very important. And so keeping track of the stars was something that was very godly, very spiritual. And I think today it would be for us too. In our world, especially in larger cities, we never see the stars hardly, barely. We see a blanket up here of dimness above us typically, except when we go out camping somewhere or we're driving out in the desert or somewhere else in the plains. But everyone would see the stars every night back then. It was an important part of their life. Now, as far as Herod goes, Herod was a despicable person by all accounts. And about 30 years before this, which is an interesting thing, a prophet of the Jewish sect, the Essenes, that's the ones that were likely at Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls, had told Herod that he would reign for 30 years when he was first put in to power in Jerusalem. Well, about this time coming up here is about his 30 years that he reigns. But because of this prophecy from an Essene to Herod, he always treated the Essenes well because he felt like they supported him and they knew that he was going to be in power for 30 years. So maybe he was thinking, well, they're probably likely not to fight against me politically because they know I'm supposed to be here for 30 years. In fact, some people even think that in the New Testament, when we hear about the Herodians, as in Herod, that maybe those are the Essenes, that maybe they kind of had his back a little bit because the Essenes were on the outside of the theocracy of the Sadducees, who were the high priests and who had control of the temple, and on the outside of the majority of the people who were Pharisees. But Herod had put in place a plan for each one of his 3 sons to follow him in succession in power here in Jerusalem. And by this time, shortly here, 2 of them at least by this time, he's already killed. And he's going to kill his 3rd son here shortly. In fact, just I think a few days before he ends up dying. He's not a good guy. But he dies in 4 BC, it looks like. Josephus, the Jewish/Roman historian, tells us that he died on the night of March 12th, March 13th, just after an eclipse of the moon in the year 4 BC. Now, of course, if the wise men are coming to him here, and then he's going to end up sending out the edict to slaughter all of the babies in Bethlehem under 2 years old down the road here, well, then this is obviously before he dies in 4 BC, if that's the case. And so it is likely, if we look at Jesus' actual birth time, that this was somewhere between 4 BC and maybe all the way to 7 BC, but probably 4 to the end of 5 BC, the beginning of 5 BC, where Jesus was probably born. Another place we can look at the birth of Jesus, the date of Jesus' birth, is at the time of his baptism, where we know that he was, according to Luke, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius when he was baptized. And if he's around 30 years old when he's baptized, well, then we can kind of date that as well. And the 15th year would have been 27 to 28 AD. So that's 2 or 3 years earlier than, again, that we would have for a birth of Jesus other than 1 AD. So we know it's before. And most scholars would agree that it's somewhere between 4 and 5 BC, or 4 and 5 BC. Now the wise men, who we're never told who they are. We have this short little account of this visit to Herod and then to Christ. But again, why? Well, because there's an assumption to the audience of Matthew here of who these people are and what this narrative here is talking about, what it's fulfilling. It's fulfilling prophecy. So first of all, let's look at who they are. A lot of people say that because of the term Magi, that the 3 wise men or the 10 wise men, we have no idea what number of them they are. Most people say 3 because there are 3 gifts, but we don't know. It could be 3 because that would be typical of visits, right? Kind of like the visits to Abraham. There were 3 angels that visited Abraham. There is Peter, James, and John, before they were Peter, James, and John, that visited Adam and Eve, right? So that would fall in line with a lot of stories of these angelic visits or of messengers. But we really don't know the number. Now, Persia also had conquered Babylon. Remember that right after Lehi's time, a lot of the elite established the court of Jerusalem had been taken away to Babylon. Well, when they came back from Babylon, it was only a portion of them. Most of the people likely stayed in Babylon, most of the Jews. So there's a very strong center there, which is also to the east of Jerusalem. Well, everything's practically to the east or the south. But Persia ends up conquering Babylon. And it's actually Persia that lets them go. So we could say they're attributed to Persia because Babylon became a part of the Persian Empire. But there were Jews in Persia also. And it's likely, right, that these visitors, these wise men, are Jews. And if they're wise men, they could very well be prophets. Now, why do we have the tradition of kings? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that they represent the Melchizedek priesthood, which is the royal priesthood. I'm going to get into that in just a minute here. Secondly, what they do by bringing the gifts, these are royal gifts to a king who is the baby Jesus. So it could be from that narrative that we see that these are kings. There's traditions about what their names are, where they come from, but we don't know any of this information. Nothing in the scriptures and nothing that seems to be historic. Another possibility is Arabia. There are records that show that during the time of King Josiah, he was the one that purged everything, the theocratic purge, the theological purge of the temple and of the practices and sacrifices, the great centralization of priesthood power in Jerusalem, that tens of thousands of priests left at this time. And where did they go? They went to Arabia, we're told. Now, Arabia back then is probably not Saudi Arabia of today. It probably has something more to do with maybe Jordan and the area of Petra and maybe down in Moab. So not quite as far away as Saudi Arabia. But in a lot of recordings, when they just say the east, they mean this area, this older area of Arabia. And so when we just hear the east, it could be that that is a specific place, not really just a direction. And remember Paul, after he is converted and he sees the Lord, he later ends up going where? To Arabia for a few years. Why? Who's there? Now, some biblical scholars say that maybe he went to Sinai, but it would make a lot of sense if he was going somewhere to be taught and trained in the older ways about the new covenant, because he was a Pharisee, right? He didn't have that background. And once he had spent 2 or 3 years in Arabia with people of the older tradition, people that were looking forward to the Son of God at this time, and were already followers of Jesus Christ, then he would come back and continue preaching throughout the Greek and Roman world. So Arabia is a real possibility there. Lastly, speaking of the older ways, the Hebrew word for the east is Mikkedem. And Mikkedem also is the word for the ancient ones. So is it possible that they're talking about people that believed in more of an ancient time? We even use the term Ancient of Days for Michael/Adam and even for Jesus Christ, Jehovah. Could we really just be talking about here they came from the old ways? That's a possibility as well. Just some chewing gum there to work with. So these wise men, these Magi, are here with Herod, which, by the way, how do they get access to Herod? Just 3 guys coming in? Maybe that's another reason why it's thought that they're kings. Maybe they're Essenes. Maybe they're high up in some group out in the east or who knows where, and they're Essenes. And because they're Essenes, they are maybe Herodians, or they are at least favored by Herod. They're able to get an audience with him. That could make sense. But they're saying to Herod, they come into Herod and they say, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" So it's interesting that they're almost certainly Jewish. And they're asking Herod, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" This is important, the way that Matthew's setting this up. "For we have seen his star in the east." Did they see it back where they were, or do they see it toward the east? "And are come to worship him." So they know of the prophecies. They should know that he would be in Bethlehem. For whatever reason, they don't. But this is going to be a very triggering thing to Herod. He is not going to want to hear about the king of the Jews for various reasons. Remember, the Essene told him he would reign for 30 years. He's already been worried about the competition with his sons. He is not a good guy. He is going to, at all costs, fight off anybody that's going to try and take power from him. And he knows that his time may be up. So he's very interested in finding more out about this. And he would have probably been aware of talk about this. Again, even those that didn't believe in Jehovah being the Messiah had a belief from Daniel's prophecy and other Old Testament prophecies that the Messiah, who was a king, or at least a political figure of some sort that would take power from the enemies of the Jews, they believed that he would be coming soon. So there's talk about this going on. So Herod, when he hears this, he's very troubled. Of course he is. In fact, he had even called himself with that title, the King of the Jews, even though he wasn't Jewish. He was an Edomite, right, from Esau. And again, there is a prophecy here. So Matthew is touching on prophecy. Here's the prophecy. It was basically, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall go out from Jacob." A star shall go out from Jacob, "and a scepter shall rise from Israel. Edom," which is where Herod is from, what his lineage is, "shall be dispossessed, and Seir also, his enemies, while Israel acts in strength." Okay, that is back in the book of Numbers. So Matthew is, again, tying in the Old Testament here. He's tying in the prophets. And so there's a lot of prophecies about the star, or a star, that are rumored around at this time. And the Jews had their own conception of this, right? They believed that the star was the Messiah. And in fact, later, during a later Jewish revolt, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, but later, from several Jews that remained in the area in Palestine, there was another revolt in, I think it was 132 AD, and the leader of that revolt was Bar Kokhba, which is the son of the star. That's what that means. And he was kind of a political, messianic figure. So all of this is going on and running through Herod's mind at this time. So he calls his scribes and the chief priests together, and he's saying, where is Christ supposed to be born? And they say to him that it's going to happen in Bethlehem. And so Herod says to the wise men, when did you see the star? Which is interesting, right? It's not some big, massive, new, bright star, at least not to Herod. He would have noticed it. So for them, it may have been a normal star, and maybe it was the timing of when maybe that star was new because it came up over the horizon at that time of year. Or maybe there was a conjunction of 2 or 3 stars that created it as being a little bit brighter. Who knows really what this star is? It's kind of elusive, because we think about on the other side of the world, in the Americas during this time, remember Samuel the Lamanite, in 5 BC or so, had given the prophecy of the day and the night, and the day being completely light. So something happened, at least on that night. Now, of course, the wise men here could be following up here on Christ's birth maybe as much as 2 years later. So we don't know really what they're following, but it seems to be more of an astronomy thing that they're guided by. And so he says to the wise men, hey, go and find this King of the Jews, and when you find him, come back and tell me where he is. Of course he wants to know where he is. Then we get this interesting phrasing here. It says that the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. If we're talking about a normal star here, how in the world can you possibly see something that's right over where someone is? That doesn't really make any sense at all. So what are they talking about? Again, elusive. Now at this time, they're in a house. Now it may have been that they had a house near a cave, or maybe it was a home where the stable was, so to speak. Probably a home built out of stone. But it says that they came into the home and they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now here is, I think, the most important part of this little story here. Why gold and frankincense and myrrh? Usually the story we get on this is that, well, because it provided value to them to go down to Egypt and stay down in Egypt and then return later. But why wouldn't they just bring him money? Again, why is Matthew specifically pointing out these gifts? There's a reason. Gold was plated all over the temple. It is a royal gift for a king, and it is what the Holy of Holies was completely covered in. So we start thinking about that, and then we go to the frankincense. What is the frankincense? Well, the frankincense is what is used as part of what is burned at the altar of incense in front of the veil by the high priest, or by the priest that is administering the prayers for that day. That's what that represents, prayers. And then myrrh is related to death and resurrection and healing. And it is what would be mixed in. It's also, these are resins. Frankincense and myrrh are resins, mostly brought up from the frankincense trail, which is probably what Lehi followed down in Saudi Arabia. But myrrh was mixed in with the oil that was typically only used, it sounds like, in the temple, and would be used for healing and for anointing. So that would be a kingly gift and a high priestly gift. So what we're getting here, looking at this duality here, I think, is that we're getting the new Melchizedek king, These are royal gifts, and they are temple gifts. They are representing a restoration of the entire priesthood to the new Melchizedek. Another way to look at this, if looking at one of my interpreters there of the higher and the lower law, is that the frankincense could represent the Aaronic priesthood. It is for prayers. That's an Aaronic priesthood function. And the myrrh would be the Melchizedek priesthood, mixed with the oil for healing and anointing for a king and a priest and a priestess. And so you would have both parts of the priesthood there. You have the gold, and then the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood. And this would also represent in the temple a restoration of the entire priesthood and the fullness of the gospel. But again, as we see throughout these stories, as we have gone through these episodes here on Christmas, we are looking at a restoration. The birth of Christ is the biggest thing to happen, obviously, but part of that happening is a restoration of doctrine, a restoration of priesthood power, a restoration of the temple and its ordinances. Now, remember I had talked about in the last episode how Luke had portrayed the nativity scene as the Holy of Holies in royal high priestly garb, wrapped in swaddling clothes, on a throne in a manger, and with the two beasts on the side, the cherubim. Well, we get the same kind of a scene at Jesus' death. When he goes into the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, we get a lot of specifics there also. Remember that in one of the accounts, the women go to the door of the opening of the tomb, and they look in, and what do they see? They see two angels, and it specifically says one on each side of where Jesus had laid, right? The throne. We know that when he was wrapped up in swaddling clothes, in linen, that he was wrapped up with frankincense and myrrh, with spices, very, very expensive spices. This is pointed out, and enough in there that it was for a royal burial. And then, of course, we get the additional comment about him leaving his clothing there, folded up, his napkin there, on where he laid. So there's specifics here that go over the clothing, that go over the frankincense and the myrrh, the spices, and the place where he laid, just like in a manger, with the two creatures, angels, cherubim, on either side. And Matthew is doing something similar here in recreating a temple environment, temple symbolism, temple imagery. Jesus is the new Melchizedek, and he is the restorer of the fullness of the gospel. Now, we can't obviously imagine or even get a glimpse of what these shepherds and these wise men felt as they came to see the baby or the very young Jesus. And so, fulfilling prophecy, these shepherds and these wise men become a part of the story of the birth of Christ, of the Christmas story. And they become a part of the fulfillment of prophecy, of the condescension of God, the birth of the new Melchizedek, the King of Kings, the firstborn, the Davidic king, the Savior of the world. He is born in the most humble of circumstances, and he dies in the most humble of circumstances. He lowers himself below all of us in his mortality, and then rises above us all and beckons us to rise with him. I'll talk to you next time.